use of native speaker norms? That's a question for TEFLologists. Is it better to focus on form or to focus on forms? That's a question for TEFLologists. If you use a textbook, is your classroom authentic, or should your approach be more learner-centric, from feedback to learner autonomy? We'll discuss it all on TEFLology.
Hello and welcome back to the TEFLology Podcast, a podcast all about teaching English as a foreign language and related matters. In this week's episode, we have an interview with Richard J. Sampson, who is an associate professor in the Center for Foreign Language Education and Research at Rikkyo University in Japan. His research focuses on motivation, complexity, and language learner psychology. In addition to research articles, he is the author of Complexity in Classroom Foreign Language Learning Motivation, a practitioner perspective from Japan, and co-editor of the upcoming Complexity Perspectives on Researching Language Learner and Teacher Psychology. Rob spoke to Richard Sampson recently on the internet. Enjoy.
So this is Rob, and today I'm speaking to Richard Sampson. Richard, thank you for agreeing to be on the podcast.
Thanks, Rob, for inviting me.
So we're going to be talking today about motivation and L2 learner psychology. So first, could you tell me a little bit about your background, about how you entered teaching and how you first got interested in the areas of motivation and psychology?
Sure. So my background, I'm originally from Australia and I studied education for my bachelor's degree. So I was a teacher and I am a teacher. I was intending to be a primary school teacher in Australia, but my life took a different road when I came to Japan. So obviously I used my teaching background in Japan to be an English teacher. And how I got interested in motivation and psychology, well, to be honest, initially it wasn't about the students that I was teaching. It was more about myself, which sounds a bit egotistical. I was studying a master's externally, so online, with a university in Australia while I was working here in Japan, and one of the units was kind of about individual differences. And when I was going through that unit, I was also in the process of studying Japanese myself. And I was really interested in how my own motivation was evolving through the process of learning Japanese by myself, not going to a school or anything, but in this context, in a Japanese context. And so I could kind of bounce my own experiences off of the literature that I was reading about motivation at the time. So that's kind of how I got interested in it.
Okay, so before we get too deep into the weeds on these topics, I think it might benefit the listeners to clarify some terminology. A few days ago, you sent me some papers of yours to help me prepare for this interview, and some of the words that you used included self-concept, dynamic motivation, and complexity. And I was wondering if you could give a quick explanation of what you mean by those three terms.
Sure. Well, I think my take on self-concept is pretty straightforward. It's the beliefs that we hold about ourselves, and obviously sometimes these come to the surface more, and a lot of the time they're more subconscious. I've recently been leaning more towards thinking about identity, because self-concept focus more on just ourselves, whereas identity also includes our positioning in groups as well, in different groups. So although they're very related, I'm leaning towards using identity more now. Mm-hmm. Dynamic motivation, again, sounds like a highfalutin idea, but it basically just means that motivation ebbs and flows, it fluctuates, which is not news to anyone who has ever been motivated or demotivated. But again, especially when I first got into reading motivation research, it really didn't take into consideration or give a good picture at all of motivation as being dynamic, which was very surprising to me. And then the third term, complexity, is a bit of a tough one. It basically means this idea that there are some, well, I'll use the word systems, but that makes it sound kind of dry and theoretical. But basically there are some systems that have various parts that interact in such intricate ways that you can't just take away one part and look at that, because it depends on all the other parts together, and all of these parts interact, and through their interactions some kind of whole system phenomenon takes place. So I guess easy examples, I don't know whether easy is the right word, but I consider a class group to be a complex system, or a society, cultures, things like that in human terms.
I think I've heard like murmurations being described as that kind of thing, right? Like
yes. Yeah, I love that image of birds flying around together, and I think certainly Diane Larson Freeman has used that image in presentations and whatnot. And it's this idea that one bird on its own is just doing its own thing. It's only reacting to the birds closest to it, and yet when we look at the whole group of birds, this very interesting patterns happen.
Yeah. So I guess your work is kind of is like looking at the class and how the groups of students form that kind of complexity.
Yeah, which is something that I've tried to focus on in my writing and also any presentations that I do. I think sometimes people are put off by the term complexity theory and think that it's some obscure theoretical concept. But I really think that that teachers deal with it day in, day out. And although there are special terms that are used in complexity theory, they're nothing that teachers don't naturally understand anyway.
Right. Well, I guess we'll come to that aspect of your work a little bit later on. But to start with, I wanted to focus in a little bit on motivation. You talked about the ebb and flow of motivation. And in your 2016 book, you note a gap between your students' probable future need for English and their lack of motivation in studying it. So even though they're going to need it, they don't seem motivated to actually study it. Could you talk a little bit about that gap and maybe give some idea of how your research has helped to explain it?
Sure. I don't think this is a phenomenon particular to Japan, but I think it's certainly very prevalent in Japan. Is the fact that everyone not just young people, but particularly in my work contexts, young people are kind of flooded with messages about one particular language, English, and how important it is and how vital it is to study English. And the education system also kind of confirms these messages through imposing English education on almost everyone. And yet, and I think this is something that I've found that people outside of Japan think very surprising. Many Japanese people don't have much need for English in their day-to-day life and don't encounter it. A lot of people, for example, I was in Barcelona a couple of years ago at a conference there and talking to people in Barcelona, and they couldn't believe that my Japanese students had never heard of Taylor Swift. They, we kind of think that English pop culture is ubiquitous. It's everyone in the world knows all about this, and perhaps in Europe that might be the case, or in many countries that might be the case. But certainly for many of my students, and I should say, up until recently, most of my students have been engineers. They just don't encounter this kind of pop culture. So they don't have any natural exposure to English in their day-to-day lives, and yet they're getting bombarded with messages that this thing English is incredibly important. And so there's this gap. They don't understand really why they're needing to study English, but they've got this vague idea that society tells them they will need it at some point in the future.
In terms of actually addressing this, you talk about teacher-instigated change action and how that can affect student motivation. And you also mentioned some activities that you use to encourage students to reflect on their understandings of self and their motivation related to English learning. Could you give some examples of those activities? And do you think they'd actually be useful for all teachers to include in their classes?
Yeah, sure. I'll firstly just say about the teacher-instigated change action, something I want to make clear here, and this is connected with my my kind of focus on complexity. I take a little different understanding of action research and how teachers can instigate change. But again, probably many teachers will understand this. So my take is that, as a teacher, I can prepare something that I think may well get my students thinking. It might bump something in their psychological systems and change something. But I certainly can't predict that that's going to be the case. And again, it might affect different students in very different ways. And I've certainly seen that in my research. Sometimes in the same class, the same activity, the same teacher-instigated change action works in very beneficial ways for some students. And for other students, it's a complete nightmare. And I feel terrible about what I've exposed some of my students to, or the kinds of thoughts that they've had to come up with. But on a more positive note, I think so. For example, various activities that I've asked my students to kind of work together to write a kind of story from between now and a future where they are using English in some way. And they work together with a partner and construct this story. And make a point of asking them to include obstacles that are in the way, because a lot of research has shown that it's not just enough to imagine a rosy future, but you actually need to imagine obstacles and how you're going to overcome those obstacles on the way to this rosy future for a positive possible future idea to have a motivating effect. They write these stories together, and then they also need to share them together with other students in the class. And that's something that I've found incredibly beneficial in most cases, is the sharing in the class. So not just doing these activities by themselves, but sharing ideas with other students. And, of course, that then gives them new input, new ideas about how their own possible future ideas could change or gain more detail from what other students have said as well. Just one more example. Connecting back to the kind of idea of messages in society that I just talked about. That's actually something that I do with my students, is that I ask them to individually think about their life up to the point that I encounter them, and the messages that they've come across about English in their lives, from school teachers, from their family, from society, from cram school teachers, wherever. And to write some of those messages down, and when they encountered them and how they felt about the message at the time. And then they share those messages together with other students, and again, comparing. One student might have encountered the same message as another student, but had a completely different emotional reaction to that message. And then I actually collect their messages and kind of find some messages that are shared across the class, and I reintroduce them to the class in groups and ask them to then discuss that message and decide whether they agree with it or disagree with it, and why. And then again, we come back together as a whole class to discuss these shared messages as well. So a lot of the activities are making students more conscious of perhaps things that they've absorbed throughout their lives, messages about English and whatnot, and just sharing them and seeing how other students have reacted to these ideas as well.
What's the benefit of that, do you think, in terms of language learning? Is there a tangible benefit, or how do you see that?
I think, well, so I usually do these kinds of activities, but I also ask students to then write reflections about doing the activities. And often what comes up in students' reflections is that they just never, ever had the chance to sit down and think about these things. So these ideas were always there. They're able to say something, they're able to discuss about these ideas when asked to, but they've never had an opportunity to actually sit down and talk about these things. They've been studying English in most cases for 6+ years, but never really had an opportunity to think about why they're doing it. It was always kind of taken for granted. And so I think that's very, well, what students seem to say is that that's beneficial for them, even the opportunity to think about these ideas. And of course, to hear what other students think. And sometimes they'll hear different things from other students, and sometimes they'll hear similar ideas. And again, that's a very beneficial thing, because they can think, oh, well, if that person is thinking it as well, then maybe I'm okay.
Right. Yeah. Well, there I guess you start to bring in the element of the group dynamics and the effect of individual and group motivation. So you talked a little bit earlier about the L2 self, and another idea that you often raise is ideal classmates. I was wondering if you could, well, first of all, explain what ideal classmates is, and then maybe talk a little bit about the connections between the individual and the group in terms of motivation.
Sure. Some very big questions there as well. Ideal classmates is an idea that I've been working on and off over the last couple of years. So where I came across it was in an article or some research by Tim Murphy, Joe Fallett, Tetsuya Fukuda, and Yoshifumi Fukada, some other researchers from Japan. And their idea was basically to ask students at the start of a semester or whatnot, when they come together as a class group, to individually imagine what they would like other students to do in an ideal English learning class group. So how they would like other students to behave to make an ideal classroom. And they collected these ideas, and in their research, they, as far as I know, they just collected the ideas, and then again at the end of the semester or partway through the semester, they asked the students whether they were acting on any of those ideas or not. My research is a bit more explicit. I collect these ideas and then deliberately ask students to, okay, so this is what other students in the class would like you to be doing. So, for example, even such simple things as smiling. Other students would like people in this class to smile, or act positively, or to use only English, things like that. They're not incredibly complicated things. And then I'd say to my students, okay, this is what other people in this class want you to be doing. So, choose one and try to act on it during the lesson. And so I leave it up to them to decide which one they want to act on, or whether they want to act on one or not. So that's a bit about ideal classmates. In some ways, I've had this conversation with Joe Fallett. I'm not really a fan of the word ideal because it sounds a bit like perfectionism to me. So usually when I introduce it to students, I'll use the kind of terminology I just used. This is what other students would like you to be doing, rather than this is what students would ideally like you to do, or something like that. I don't know. Maybe it doesn't make that much difference, but yeah.
It sounds a little bit like a. Is it John Rawls, The Veil of Ignorance? Like if you were, if you're designing a society, but you don't know where you will be in that society. So what society would you design if you didn't know, where you would be positioned within it? It sounds a little bit like that.
Okay, I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with it.
Okay. Sorry, it's my sociology background coming through.
Thanks, Rob. And my lack of one coming through.
But it sounds kind of similar. You've like if you were going to design your ideal class, your ideal classmates, what would you want them to be like? You don't know what your position necessarily would be within that class, but what would you like people to? How would you like people to behave? How would you like people to act? That kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I was interested in about this research, and from having tried it out myself, was that often, in basic teacher education courses, we learn to kind of set some class rules at the start of the semester. But depending on how you set up class rules, the whole idea of a rule is that if you don't do this thing, then you're punished in some way, or it's a negative thing. Whereas this is kind of setting it up in a more positive way. Hopefully, it's saying that this is how everyone in this class, we've agreed that this is how we want to behave and the kinds of actions we would really appreciate other people doing. So I think it's a bit more positive than class rules. I'm sorry, you also combined this ideal classmates with the idea of
the L2 self.
Yeah. The way that Tim Murphy and his associates, the way that they introduce it, yes, they connect it with the idea of the ideal self, L2 future self concepts. And yeah, I think it connects with that as well, because you're kind of, in some ways, envisioning an ideal class. So there is a kind of imagery component to it. And I guess also in the way that I've been doing it, then asking students to actually take the step and act on one of these hopes. They will obviously have some kind of, what I found in my research is that they kind of set themselves these hopes as little goals, and they often reflect at the end of the lesson as to whether they've achieved their goal or not. So that implies that they have some kind of image of, somebody who is, one of these ideal classmates who is proactively using English, and they compare themselves with that image and decide whether they've been able to achieve that over the course of that lesson or not.
Is the relationship between the individual and the class or the group? Here you're kind of outlining positive ways that there's a connection, right? So I was wondering, there was one question I sent to you which you didn't seem very keen on answering. Is it possible for it to go the other way, that one individual who perhaps is not very cooperative, and that they don't care whether about the impact that they're having on their classmates, is there a possibility that they can kind of throw off this group dynamic?
I think there's always that possibility, whether we're doing some kind of activity like the ideal classmates activity or not. The only thing that I've published so far about ideal classmates, that time that I did it worked very, very well. But this is something that I've had conversations with various colleagues about. And as most teachers know, we can do something one semester with a group of students, or even one day with a group of students, and then the very next day we try the same activity and with a different group of students, and for whatever reasons it just falls apart. So I've actually just recently done the ideal classmates activity again over a semester with a group of students, and most of them didn't take to it. I don't want to force them to do it, but at the start of every lesson I put up a slide and I asked them, so you can choose one of these. What do you want to act on today? And if you want to act on one of these, then just write it down somewhere to remind yourself throughout the lesson. And that's basically it. And they wrote reflections at the end of the class again, each time over semester. And out of a group of about 30 students. There were very few students who actually consistently took up the ideal classmates and acted on it. The few that did seemed to get a lot out of it, and were really very focused on trying to improve themselves as they saw it. But many students didn't. And certainly there were some students in that particular class that were, as you pointed out in your question, quite unmotivated, and just really basically rolled their eyes whenever I mentioned ideal classmates.
Right.
So it's certainly not a dynamite solution to improving classroom dynamics. It is something that that I think is worth investigating more. But it's always going to depend on the students that come together, and I think if you get a certain amount of students that are doing it, then it kind of has a knock-on effect to other students as well. But if you don't get enough, then maybe there aren't huge benefits emergent from it. But there needs to be more research done into it.
I was wondering, just listening to you then, if it's the case that the ideal classmates activity is affecting the students' motivation, or if, because you said some students really got into it. Do you think it was affecting their motivation, or do you think that the fact they got into it reflected the fact they were already highly motivated, whereas the students who didn't get into it just were never motivated in the first place?
Yeah, I think that really goes into complexity. I think there are a whole lot of reasons as to why something clicks with certain students and it doesn't with other students. I'm kind of doing a case study on some of the students for whom it did click this last time I did it, and looking at them, and it's still in my analysis is still in process. But for some students, it seems like well, again, there are various factors coming together here. One is that they've made this transition from high school to university, and so it's a kind of time of life when, in some ways, you might be trying to reinvent yourself. And some of the students that I'm focusing on, it seems like they've noticed certain aspects of their personality that they themselves aren't really happy with, and they'd like to change, and they've found some way to make small steps to change that part of their personality through their English classes, through acting on these ideal classmates each week.
Right.
But yes, I find that really interesting. I will also have to see why on earth a handful of students took up this opportunity, and many students just didn't. So I don't have clear answers for you yet about that, Rob.
Okay, that's fine. I don't demand them. So maybe sticking with the theme of complexity, you talk about in your more recent work on learner psychology, you talk about circular causality.
Yes.
In relation to like developing emotions during the learning process. Can you give an example of that?
Yeah, sure. I think there are various ways we can talk about circular causality. I'll try and make this as clear as possible and then give you an example. So a term that's often used in complexity theory is something called emergence. And one way of thinking about emergence is that, put simply, parts at a lower level interact, and through these interactions, something happens at a higher level. So the group comes together at a higher level or something like that. But what circular causality in emergence means is that it's not just a one-way process. So not only do the parts at a lower level interact or a shorter time scale interact and something comes together at a higher level, some phenomenon, but also this phenomenon at a higher level loops back and affects things at a lower level as well. So we always have this circular process going on. And an example from my research is, I'll use personality again because this is something that I'm starting to get more interested in. And unfortunately, there's been some research into personality and language learning, but it's often taken quite a simplistic view of just traits and using questionnaires to try and uncover how personality interacts with the language learning process. And I'm interested in a bit deeper ideas. So, students have a certain personality. They have certain understandings about their own personality, and they come into a classroom and they're influenced in how they act in some particular activity because of their understandings of their personality. So this is a kind of long time scale process, their personality, which has developed over their entire life, impacting on how they act and how they understand their actions in a very short time scale process in the classroom. But then, of course, also what happens during that activity will, even if in a very small way, it will impact back onto their understandings of personality. So if they understand themselves as a shy person and somebody who doesn't want to talk with new people, and they find themselves, not just doing this in their first language, but actually doing it in a second language and able to interact with a new student and actually have fun interacting with that new student, then that will obviously, and what I find in my research is that students realize that it does have some kind of impact back onto their understandings of their personality. So this is the kind of circular causality that I'm talking about.
There's a phrase which came up in one of your papers, which I thought was very interesting. You argued for the value of teachers being aware of the ways in which activity in the classroom might be emotionally coloured by students being themselves. And it struck me that maybe this is something that teachers who spend a lot of time with students and are often, very kind of attuned to their students' feelings and emotions and what's going on in the classroom. This seems to me something that teachers might understand kind of on an intuitive level, but maybe within kind of SLA literature, you mentioned, this kind of the simplistic views that are sometimes represented in research. So do you think that this is something which is understood by teachers, but you're kind of trying to capture it a bit more in the research literature, or how do you see that?
Yeah, I think so. I think in some ways when you read my sentence back to me, I felt it didn't represent exactly what I meant, but it's now set in stone in a research article somewhere. So I'm a bit disappointed about that. But I do agree with you that I think that probably teachers in many cases understand their students as real people a lot better than what comes across in research literature a lot of the time, and theoretical work a lot of the time. That said, there are always going to be situations where teachers are also constrained in what they can do with their students, and there aren't really opportunities. They need to teach a certain syllabus, and there aren't opportunities in whatever particular textbook they've been asked to teach to allow students to be themselves, or to show themselves as much as perhaps teachers might like them to. But I think my research, what I hope to show through my research, is certainly that we need to have a more holistic idea of our students, because of course Emma Shioda's ideas are very pertinent here. As she always argues, these people aren't just language learners. They're complex individuals, as we all are, and yet we only see them in our classrooms. And when we're doing our research, perhaps in many cases we're only looking at them as language learners. But what comes out from my research a lot is that there's a lot going on. And I think that's something that I found a bit frustrating with research, is that it often tries to compartmentalize certain psychological elements, but they're so interrelated with other psychological elements and the context and the social context and the individual's history of life, that it just doesn't make any sense to look at one psychological factor as a factor on its own. And I kind of hope that's a direction that research is taking more now. And I think it's something that is what will be challenging to do, to take a more holistic view. And I do still think that we need to, you can't just focus on everything all at the same time, but at the same rate, we do need to somehow find a way to represent in research writing that, for example, emotions are interacting with other parts of student psychologies and their lives and whatnot.
So you can kind of have a description of the whole complexity of the system, but at any one time just focus on one part of the system.
Yeah. And that's something that, obviously there are problems with the way that we represent research, to try and find ways that we can do justice in, within a certain word count, or in an academic presentation or whatnot. We can do justice to this complexity is a challenge. But I don't think, I hope that we can continue to work on finding ways to better represent our learners as complex individuals, in their social groups, and not just say, well, this complexity stuff is too hard work. It's easier to just look at one thing at a time, because I don't see the point in that anymore.
Right.
Because no one lives their life as just a motivated person. No one does that.
Right. Well, maybe as a final question, we can talk a little bit about kind of the practicalities, or the practical side of this research. So, I think that for a lot of people, motivation is quite an appealing topic, because if you can motivate your students, that's like key to language learning, right? And so I think that's why people get very interested, especially, master's students and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But do you think that the study of motivation and, psychology and so on, is that prescriptive in that sense, or is it more descriptive? Because I guess there are problems with saying, here are my research results. The implication of this is that you can psychologically manipulate your students to do something. What is the practical takeaway of this, do you think? Or is there one?
Yeah, I think there are certainly both approaches. I think there are many books. I don't want to be critical of them because I do think that books, how to motivate your students, they have many interesting ideas that teachers, practical ideas that teachers can take up. So they would be more, obviously more prescriptive. My take on it is that, I don't want to be prescriptive. I think there are things that we can learn about motivation. And so again, Emma Ushioda has talked about the ethical problems of the whole nudging people to do things approach. And I guess, for example, if you think about the ideal classmates activity, in some ways, even by presenting that, you're nudging your students. You're, as a teacher, as somebody in power, you're presenting this idea to students, and there must be some kind of, depending on how the individual student takes that presentation of the idea, they might feel some compulsion. I need to do this because my teacher is presenting it to me in this way. But I think what I hope with my research and the kinds of action research that I do is that the ways that I'm presenting ideas to my students, it's an opportunity for them to think about things and to discuss things with their classmates. And what they want to take away from that is up to them. So, hang on, I'm just thinking a bit more. As I kind of hinted before, there have been cases where that hasn't gone well. A couple of years ago, I used the idea of near peer role models, which again is one of Tim Murphy and Associates' ideas. I showed some of my engineering students a short video interview with one of my past students who had gone on to grad school and was doing research internationally and having to use English. And for some students, that was incredibly motivating, it seems. They got more of a clear image of what their future might be, and they really connected with that, and it opened up possibilities for them. But for other students in the same class at the same time, it just really created a whole lot of pressure. They were suddenly faced with this reality, I might actually really need to use this stuff in the future. Oh my goodness. And they became quite anxious about that possibility. So we can't really, if we try to introduce some activities based on what motivational research shows us, we can't really predict how they're going to turn out for any individual learner. We can look at past research and hope that this activity might help our students in some particular way, but I think there's always the possibility that it might go in another direction for certain people as well.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much for that. Just before we finish, is there anything that you think our listeners should turn to or should explore to get more information about this topic?
Well, I think there's some interesting work being done with complexity theory in general, but also with psychology and L2 psychology. And I do think that it's an area that is going to expand in the years to come. I've just been reviewing a book proposal for a publisher that looks at L2 individual differences and uses complexity theory as well. And it's very interesting to see this presentation of a whole lot of individual differences interacting with one another. To plug myself, I've got a book coming out with a colleague, another Richard Pinner, here in Japan.
Former guest on the podcast twice.
Okay. Probably at the end of this year, that looks at, well, it's an edited volume and a whole lot of researchers from around the world kind of, instead of presenting actual research findings, they talk about what they did, how they did it from a complexity perspective, and how that was a useful way of doing things. So it kind of acts as a subscript on their research itself. So rather than a how-to book, it's a whole lot of examples of what people are doing and how they've been doing it and how they've found it useful. So if you're interested in complexity perspectives, then that book is coming out with Multilingual Matters, hopefully in November. Complexity, it's a long title, Complexity Perspectives on L2 Learner and Teacher Psychology, I think.
Okay. I'm sure if people put those keywords into Google, they'll find it.
They'll find it. It's a bit embarrassing that it doesn't roll off my tongue.
Okay, well, thank you very much for this interview. It's been very interesting.
Thank you, Rob. So you've had some interesting questions that have made me think as well. I only hope I've been able to answer them somewhat adequately.
Oh, it's been fantastic. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you once again to Richard for talking to us. We appreciate it very much. And if you're interested in reading more about his work, the name of his book again is Complexity in Classroom Foreign Language Learning Motivation, a Practitioner Perspective from Japan. So you can find TEFLology at the usual places, Facebook and Twitter, and you can also send us an email. The address is teflology@gmail.com. We'll be back soon with a regular episode, but until then, thanks for listening. Goodbye.